The opinion that Total War is dead is not a controversial opinion nowadays, but 8 to 10 years ago it would have been. Recently there's been a bit of a wave in the Total War community. Let me just give you a brief rundown. Pixelated Apollo, probably one of the larger YouTube channels, uploaded a video titled Total War Has Fallen, and immediately reactions started to pour in, with creators like Legend of Total War reacting to Apollo's video, and the Terminator reacting to Legend of Total War's video, reacting to Apollo's video, and now it's me reacting to Terminator's, Legends, and Pixelated Apollo's video. And so I appreciate it's kind of hilarious. I'm now fourth in line to feed off the whale carcass, but there we go. And I also appreciate that I'm no more valid than any one of your comments that hopefully are left on this video about my credibility and point of view, since I'm such a small channel. But I'm hoping that my opinion outside of the sort of major creator circle can kind of give a sort of more balanced point of view, maybe pick out a few things that other people aren't talking about. Let's just have a quick look at some of the comments that I've had recently, just to kind of gauge where people are at right now. This is a great one. The reason historical fans loved historical battles was because you could use tactics and units that made sense in the era. Battles were slower and battlefield tactics and formations could be used. And it's talking a little bit more about fantasy as well. We're not going to really touch on that today, but historical fans are in need of a game, and CA has failed to produce one. Honestly, I don't want CA to make an Empire 2 or Medieval 3 anymore, because there is no way they will be good. This is a very traditionalist argument, and we're going to see if this really holds up. I somewhat agree with this, I somewhat disagree with this, and hopefully we can explore that a bit more. It's a really painful time to be a historical Total War fan. We've been completely left to the wayside in favour of Warhammer vibe style. Absolutely agree, and we'll discuss that in a minute. I understand that there were a minority of fans now, so I don't really complain that much. Disagree with that. I'm glad that we have mods for Medieval 2 until, of course, I agree with that. Actually, interestingly, we're not in the minority. If you look at Legends' video, he talks about how Crusader Kings 3 has equal player numbers to Warhammer 3, and all those players have left Total War. Historical players will come back if it's a genuinely good game. I think actually we're in the majority, and somewhat of a silent majority right now. But also Warhammer fans are being left by the wayside as well. We're going to discuss why and how CA thought they could get away with it, and how they ultimately failed to do so. And this is an interesting comment here. It's crazy there's beef between historical fans and fantasy fans. Yes, absolutely, and this is only something that's been coming up recently. It says 7 months ago, but it's been developing recently as well. It used to be very much the case that historical fans and fantasy fans were butting heads quite a lot, and they still do, obviously, you can tell from these comments. But more recently, since the launch of Warhammer 3's disastrous DLCs, these fans are starting to come together and see everything from the same perspective, which is scary for CA. Okay, so those are some of the comments from the video, but it kind of gauges where people are at right now. I'm not sure I had a comment on that video, and by the way, about 300 comments or so that actually said that CA would make a good Medieval 3 or Empire 2. I think this is a general vibe that's been building in the background, and it's finally now sort of burst into the arena, burst from the seams. And so, is Total War dead? Let's discuss. There are two major opinions. One, CA is not capable of making another historical game, and two, CA is capable of making another historical game, but not in the same way as before. We're going to discuss both. Let's start with number one. This is the opinion of Pixelated Apollo and a lot of diehard historical fans in the community, and there is lots of evidence to support this. Take the dramatic downfall of the Saga series, the Total War Saga series. Several games that failed to meet expectations. We had Thrones, we had Troy, and what's even more crazy is that CA went back and tried to add 4 of the Samurai to the Saga list to make it beef it up a bit more, make it look a bit more appealing. Let's just take Thrones of Britannia. Aside from the weird and slightly hilarious outside factor that sieges were probably the best in any Total War games in Thrones of Britannia, which is kind of hilarious because sieges are terrible in most games. Apart from that, everything else was built on Attila's engine, an engine that had been developed from Rome to Attila and now have been redeveloped again for Thrones of Britannia. And even though I actually enjoy Thrones of Britannia because I'm from the UK and actually, I can relate to some of these places, most people don't really care about that. So I can understand people's frustration in the game. It's a very repetitive playstyle, battles that are cool but soon find themselves lacking the mechanics to continue to be interesting. Imagine if we had Pharaoh's formation maneuvering in Thrones of Britannia with the shield walls, and it being a brand new mechanic and how shield walls face off against each other rather than just the two units clashing. It could have been a lot better game, but with lack of cavalry, very dry and slow, repetitive, very tactically repetitive game is not good groundwork for Total War at all. And CA's most recent launch of Total War Pharaoh has also been, we can probably say, a disaster, at least initially. So much so that major Total War creators such as Legend of Total War, which I've already mentioned, who mostly give a very unbiased and reasonable opinion, have flat out refused to play the game. And there's lots of reasons for this, and I'm not going to describe them because that's not my opinion, but I do agree with a lot of those reasons. After playing this game for a period of time, I think I've come to a reasonable conclusion as to why the game is so unpopular, even after the newly released Dynasties campaign expansion. And that is, in essence, a Total War game is supposed to transport you back to the battlefield, right? Crusader Kings 3 is supposed to transport you back to the court, to the decision making, to the inner workings of politics, and that does that really well. But Total War takes the different approach of splitting the game in half and transporting you back to the battlefield. And the reason it does that is because it wants you to connect with your troops. It wants you to connect with your army, your characters. And it's supposed to make you relive explosive moments, exciting victories, and thrilling cavalry charges, for example, all the while keeping a firm hold on historical accuracy. And yet, if you watch any major historical Total War creator, such as Heir of Carthage, for example, who I've watched for the last 10, 12 years, however long he's been going, I've been pretty much keeping up with him. The vibe of their Pharaoh campaigns are completely different from their Empire Napoleon campaigns. I don't know if any of you remember Heir of Carthage's famous Empire Patchy campaign. I'm not sure which faction it was now, but I remember him connecting so well with Patchy, the character, but Patchy was always, I think he had a patch on his arm or something, and he was the one that they connected with. It was Patchy's adventure. I think it was using just a ridiculously cheap and terrible unit, I think. I can't remember if it was Town Militia or something similar to that. The point I'm trying to make is, just take Heir of Carthage's campaign in Empire, Napoleon or whatever. Even in Carthage, the original Rome 1 campaign, which has been putting out recently, which I thought was awesome. If you look at those campaigns and then take his Pharaoh campaign, it's very, very, very rarely, I haven't watched all his Pharaoh campaigns because it's a long time, but if you take it from an analytical approach, he isn't zooming in much, he isn't connecting with the characters, he isn't really getting that same feel as the Empire campaign that was so famous for him. And that's the point I'm trying to make. You don't see people zooming, that's a bit of a weird word, but zooming down into troops. You don't see them looking at the troops, how they march, how they're fighting. You don't really get the essence of the game. Everything is thought down from a very top-down perspective. We rarely actively engage with our own men. And you may think, well, that's not particularly relevant because there's no point anyway. It's not going to help me to fight in a better way. Actually makes it worse for me because I miss things. Right, and you're absolutely correct. But because there's no incentive to zoom in, the connection between you and your men has been severed. And what we actually find in Pharaoh is that all the units are relatively the same, and we're kind of just throwing blobs at each other, you against the AI, throwing blobs against each other. No one's really actually connected with the troops. The only thing that happens to me is when I have a last stand, or when my general has a last stand in a city, I might zoom in then to see my men fight it out. But in average battles, there's no grandeur, there's no epicness, really, unless you go out of your way to make it epic. And what you're actually saying is that there's no immersion, there's no excitement, no connection with the player to their units. I can almost guarantee that every person watching this who has played Empire Total War has at one point zoomed into their units just to see them marching, just to see them firing, not for any other reason apart from, oh, this is actually really cool because it's actually going to be an immersive experience. I would be very surprised if people took the same view with Pharaoh. I'm zooming in to see my men fight, I'm zooming in to see them marching. It's just not quite the same. It's always a very top-down, almost arcadey approach to the game, and that isn't the same vibe that people have been looking for. It's more of a Warhammer style vibe, and that's fine, but it's not a historical Total War. And that's why historical Total War and Pharaoh particularly failed, in my opinion. If this connection is somehow mishandled in the next big historical release, then it doesn't matter if it's Empire 2, it doesn't matter if it's Medieval 3, or even if it's something like Victoria Total War or something later on, it will die a slow death because players will not have the incentive or desire to keep playing because they have no connection with their troops. So that's why Total War could die. It's very simple. If you have no connection, then there's no point playing. And you have a Pharaoh, which even I'm sure a lot of you will point out, Dynasty's expansion is a great expansion. I totally agree. It's a great expansion on face value, but it hasn't got the player numbers to keep it going. One, because it was the wrong time period. Let's just be honest with ourselves. It's not widely appealing, but I understand where they were coming from, but it just doesn't have the same appeal. And so is Total War dead from this opinion? Yes, it will be dead if they don't get a grip on this player to unit connection, player to character connection, player to family tree connection, player to faction connection. If make it so bland and arcadey again, and make it all about stats and all about this stat and that stat and building it, it's just not quite the same as your characters gaining traits. And remember the Rome 1 and Medieval 2 and Empire, not so much Empire actually, let's be honest, Shogun 2, there we go, that's a good system. Those were systems that allowed the player to interact with their characters and their units because they could customize them a lot more. In Pharaoh, it's very much 5 swordsmen, 3 spearmen, several chariots, and you'll be extremely happy when you get cavalry. I mean, you might be able to use them effectively, but everything else is just so bland and boring that there's no point actually zooming in, because you're just trying to play a top-down game. You're not trying to play a game that's trying to immerse you in historical accuracy anymore. That's how Total War could die, but how could it survive? So, obviously this is opinion number 2, which is my personal opinion. CA is capable of making another historical game, but not in the same way as before. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword argument. This may be an unpopular opinion, but unfortunately it's the one that most historical players know to be true. And it's clearly defined argument as well, because if you think about it, I don't think, and this is one of the comments mentioned before, if there are any even 1 or 2 developers left from the original days. And the original Total War team is gone, and the new team arrived to follow its legacy over the years. Those original people were phased out and new people came in. Obviously, this brings up the question, how can you say that CA can make another Total War game if there isn't any of the original team left? Well, here's where we find the differences in people's opinions. Let's take Pharaoh, for example. Yes, it was overpriced. Yes, it was bad. Yes, it was buggy when it first launched. But once CA Sophia were given a little bit more time, hold on, I know what you're thinking. I'm going to give you loads of excuses for why it's a good game. I'm not going to do that. Bear with me. But once CA Sophia were given a little bit more time to reign free a little bit more of the title, the game really improved, obviously with the Dynasty's expansion. But what lets it down is the time period. We've already discussed that. It's extremely niche. The fact that it's under-sourced. There's so little source material for Total War Pharaoh that you end up with things like this unit on screen right now, which I can't remember the name of, but kind of look like elven archers, a little bit ridiculous, like Heroes of Troy or Archers of Troy or something like that. Just kind of, this really doesn't look good. And a lot of creativity had to go into making the various factions and units and kind of, going outside the circle of what was actually historical, because there's no historical material anyway. That in itself should have been a massive red flag for CA when hearing the pitch for this game, because it seems bizarre that CA would choose a time period in history where there's no source material, or very little source material. We're looking at sources that have been reading sources that have been reading sources. There's no original sources. And it's kind of a little bit weird if you think about it in that respect. Yes, it's an interesting time period, but if you're making a historical game, then it doesn't really give you much to work with. So if you're weighing out the question, is CA capable of making another game? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in regards to Pharaoh not falling flat on its face after the initial launch, and knowing the fact that the whole design, engine and flow will have to change. I mean, if they release another historical game with the Total War Troy engine on look and feel, it will just feel odd, because if it's Empire 2, for example, with a Troy style engine look and feel, I mean, it's just going to be awful, isn't it? I mean, I think people would actually be physically sick if that happened. It would just be terrible. And when I say Pharaoh not falling flat on its face, I mean that CA Sophia really turned it around with the Dynasty's expansion. Too little too late, obviously, for most people, but we'll come to why I don't think it fell flat on its face forever. I think there is some positive to this. But here's the good news, which is why I disagree with the original statement that Total War is dead completely. CA is learning from their mistakes. Now hold on, don't click off the video. I know many of you would not agree, and that's fine, but I base my assumptions on a number of things that aren't really talked about as much. I'm not going to go for the generic points here. Number 1, unscripted community outreach. Now, a lot of you are going to say, well, yes, for this game and that game, there was community outreach, and look at all the videos they put out. Yes, I understand they did that, but it wasn't unscripted, let's be honest. Look at the Pharaoh unscripted commentaries that lasted for 45 minutes, an hour, whatever. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was relatively good. But community participation, discussion, and honesty with the community is something CA has always struggled to obtain since Rome 2. The reason I say this is because from a debacle that was the lies that surrounded Rome 2, to the cancellation of Three Kingdoms 2, to the most recent Warhammer and Pharaoh controversies, price hikes, Steam review bombing, community management versus the community on Steam, to this crazy decision to put 100 million on hyenas, for then Sega to cancel it, to CA having to lose half of its staff. CA has had a bad run, and just think back to before Rome 2 launched. Okay, think back to the good old days. We had a community engagement such as Rally Point with Will and Craig, and I think Sarah. Those were the good old days leading up to Rome 2. Will actually left, by the way. I still follow him on X because I think he's actually a cool guy. Those were the good old days leading on up to Rome 2, where the show would feature all the new and exciting developments for Total War, mostly Rome 2. We're on the peak of Shogun 2. Rome 2 is coming out. We're all excited, right? I remember everybody being excited. The community show featured the company New Light, Rally Point, open and honest, or so we thought. They had all the people coming in, all designers, getting interviews. They had all these cool releases. They released information about the game on Rally Point. Wrath of Sparta was released on Rally Point. It wasn't released in a post, it was released in Rally Point. And the people really respected them and really trusted them. And obviously the most infamous episode 14, which I've talked about briefly already, Julian McKinley, the Battle AI program of Rome 2. As Rome 2 released after episode 16, which was the last episode in August, I think, the House of Cards came crashing down. I was watching back the Rally Point episodes in preparation for this video around Rome 2 launch. There's an interesting 3 to 4 month gap between episode 16 and episode 17 when Rome 2 came out, and you think, why was that? It was because everyone was very angry. Episode 17, they come back on and say, we've been answering your forum questions night and day, basically. In other words, people have been very angry and upset, and we haven't had time to do a Rally Point episode to celebrate the launch of the game because it's been awful. People were very angry with CA, especially because they'd pre-bought the game, people pre-ordered, all that kind of stuff, and the trust that had been established between the presenters on screen and the community was just completely shattered. The last time we had a Rally Point that was really face-on presenters with Warhammer 1 back in 2016, 8 years ago or so. I'm not going to be exactly on the dates, but we haven't since then had a concerted effort by CA to have a face-on engagement with the community that's unscripted to a point. Right, we've had game releases like with Three Kingdoms where we had the different presenters come, or different designers come on for a few videos. Right, that's not what I'm talking about. But with Pharaoh, they tried again after the release of Dynasties when they realised that they'd made a big mess of a situation. I think this was after the firing of a lot of CA staff and members by Sega. They had a concerted effort to try and put their face in front of the community again, with a presenter, with some staff, 45-minute long conversations that were uncut, unscripted for the most part. It faced a lot of backlash, let's be honest, but you have to give them credit for putting their face out and trying, at least attempting this, because whenever they were going to dip back into this, they were always going to face backlash, right? And building that connection with the studio and the fan, again, it's not going to be easy, but Pharaoh was the first game since Rome 2 and Warhammer 1, you could say, that attempted this in a major way. Rally Point died at the launch of Rome 2. I mean, he had another 10 or so episodes after that, but they were never very much the same after that. A good community participation program does not save Total War, and we learned this from Rome 2. You can have the best presenters like Will and Craig, you can have the best hype ever since Shogun 2, even incorporating at one point Brian Blessed to do tests with Roman equipment that were a really, really cool video actually. The game can still be terrible after all of that positive hyper marketing. So if Rome 2 failed, which it did, it wouldn't collapse the company because everyone already pre-ordered, bought into this game, right? If Rome 1 failed, the original, it would collapse the company, and so there was incentive to make it good. Whatever your opinions of Rome 2, it's a very restrictive game First in the franchise to introduce general-only armies, the first in the franchise to replace the detailed structure drawings with simple picture art, but they also restricted other things, for example, army numbers, city sizes, no family tree originally, remember, and the removal of the population list, and people really go on about that one. Like, why did they do all this stuff? Why not keep the same formula that has been working in Shogun 2? I seriously think it was just for this reason. They had a lot of backing from Shogun 2 and they thought, we need to expand our market more. And I don't think they thought that a complicated Rome 2 in the same style as Shogun 2 would appeal to a mass market, which it would have done, by the way. Well, let's dumb it down a bit. Let's make everything restricted so everyone sort of understands what's going on. Let's make everything so clear and simple. Basically dumb it down a lot to allow us to expand our market to other places. Just make cool things like cities growing on the campaign map, which is a cool feature, right? It's a very visual aid to your sort of card playing, if you will, with your city building. And then you have these huge cities on a relatively small campaign map now, because these massive cities like Rome dominated half of Italy, which is just bizarre. The reason they did it was because they're trying to restrict the player to allow more generic players to come in and be able to experience the game firsthand and buy into the game. In a weird way, CA actually did the opposite of Empire. Instead of expanding the map and being throwing too much creativity into the AI didn't work, in Rome 2 they went the other way and restricted the player more. The player felt almost coddled too much. Rome 2 now is okay, it's an okay game. I really like the smaller scale campaigns, to be honest, but it will always be tainted for the laziness and the restrictiveness, not over ambition like Empire. I'd rather have over ambition than laziness or restrictiveness in a game. If it's not the community interaction that will save Total War from untimely death, what will? And I think it's a mixture of two things right now: incentive and momentum. Let's take incentive first and we'll kind of move into momentum later. To figure this out, we have to ask ourselves a question. Why are the first games in a studio always considered the best per se? And the answer is complex, but also very simple. Studios launch games all the time, but we only hear about the studios that succeed, because the ones that don't succeed we never hear about. We only ever get the good games from the good studios. We never hear about the bad games from the bad studios, because those studios most of the time go out of business if they launch a bad game. The argument that nothing can ever beat the originals is true, because that's the discovery, right? The magic, right, of Rome 1, could say Medieval 2 as well. The discovery, the magic of discovering those games and experiences for the very first time is something that people can't ever get rid of and you can't replicate. No matter how many good games you ever release, you'll always have the first game. However, even the studios that fail have the same incentive for the most part that the studios have that succeed. And the reasons one might fail and the other succeed are numerous and irrelevant to this discussion. But they do tell us that one key thing: if your game doesn't succeed, your studio fails, right? But if it does succeed, your studio will skyrocket. And this may seem obvious, but it's the reason why Rome 1 and Medieval 2 are good. And at the time of Rome 1's launch, CA put every last penny they had into that game. Everything was on the line. If Rome 1 failed, CA was done. Completely done, been bought out by whoever. And so if it didn't do well, the company was finished. But when it launched, it broke into a niche that no other game had before, that no other company had discovered. It skyrocketed in popularity because it captured the imagination of the player. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. But it was built on the backs of the phrase of everything or nothing, right? Or all in sort of phrases. Empire, whether you like it or hate it, was CA's first attempt at ambition. And it failed for the most part, but it was still ambitious. Napoleon was better, but they really hit the nail on the head with Shogun 2 and For the Samurai. But Empire was the first time that they had capital backing to make a game that was ambitious in another way than their already solid formula. They could have made Empire like Medieval 2 and very much the same, but they decided to actually expand and try something new and try something really, really ambitious, a little bit like what they did with Rome 1, except they had the capital backing and support of the fan base now, so it wasn't quite the same. Anyway, the backlash would be temporary, it wouldn't last, the community would get over themselves, and a community that was built on the backs of the pinnacle of Shogun 2 would get drowned out in all the new players that would come in and experience it for the first time, think it's awesome, right? All the gimmicks were awesome. Rome couldn't fall, and yet Rome fell. And since then, we've kind of seen a gradual decline in historical games, right? But CA always had other avenues to fall back on. Most notoriously is the Warhammer series, right? Warhammer 1 launched historical games kind of collapsed because CA realized that they didn't need historical fans anymore, or so they thought, because they had Warhammer, and Warhammer was their new cash cow. That is until Warhammer 3 came about. And the cash cow suddenly ran out of milk, didn't it? In other words, and that's a weird analogy. But anyway, historical and fantasy fans have been separate. Now they were united. Warhammer fans finally realised that they've been sidelined by CA. They were being duped, that the laziness had returned, the lack of incentive had returned, the money was so freely flowing from all these DLCs, all these lore packs, and all this kind of stuff. But CA didn't need to really work on it as much, and it kind of collapsed upon itself. CA still had one more card stack left, and like the previous occasion when they moved from historical to Warhammer, they're now going to try and move from Warhammer to hyenas, weren't they? And hyenas, $100 million down, or whatever it was, £100 million down. It was supposed to be the new cash cow of CA. They were supposed to be able to take Warhammer and move on from it. And it was supposed to be the game that would pump out hordes of profit from microtransactions. They looked at Fortnite, they looked at all these other games and thought, we need one of those. Let's pump out as much cash as we can from these players, from microtransactions, from skins, from crates, from all the trash that these companies were doing at the time. And it was not until it was about to be launched, the realization was starting to dawn, that Sega stepped in, finally. CA had got drunk on cash, literally, and they thought in their drunken splendor that they could ignore the wails of the community that had been going on. Obviously, instead of a cash cow, hyenas was a mirage, wasn't it? It was nothing. Sega cancelled it. They realized that if they released it, it would be far worse for the brand, and CA could have collapsed completely. And so suddenly CA is at this point where they've disregarded historical fans 10 or so years ago, right? They've discarded these Warhammer fans from 3 or so years ago, and they have no cash cow. And it was a collapse. It wasn't it the community backlash collapse with the Steam numbers and the community moderators going crazy at fans on the Steam pages. Suddenly CA had nothing to fall back on. And that was the reason why Sega stepped in and had to reduce the number of CA employees and everything like that. Pharaoh launches about this time where CA is kind of collapsing in on itself, and the original Pharaoh game is terrible, right? We all know it was terrible. We all assumed it was going to be terrible because it was just a placeholder, right? It was CA saying, you know what, I don't really care about Pharaoh that much. I'm just going to pass it on to CA Sophia to kind of, produce a historical template for the players to moan about. We can all laugh at them whilst we play hyenas and get loads of money. And suddenly they realised that Pharaoh was their only hope. CA Sophia was given license to then go back and make the Dynasties campaign. They scrapped the 3-tiered system of Battle Pass or whatever it was. I can't remember, pre-ordering or whatever. They scrapped that. They released the entire DLC for free for players that owned Pharaoh, I think. And players that hadn't owned Pharaoh, they released the game at $26. So you may hate Pharaoh, and I understand why you hate Pharaoh as a historical fan, but you were never supposed to like it. It was supposed to be a template. It was supposed to be an easy win for CA, and it failed. Dynasties, I reckon, is a different game entirely. I think it's the game that CA Sophia wanted to make but weren't allowed to because it was too expensive or it was too ambitious, and CA just wanted a sort of a placeholder. So it takes guts, actually, to be honest. It takes guts for CA Sophia to double down on a game that has already been set up for failure and produce something that actually, if you re-released Dynasties as a full game, it would have been okay. I think it would have been on par with a decent game, maybe even like Three Kingdoms, I don't know. It would have been decent enough for people to pick it up at $30, $40, right? And CA would have had a positive springboard to launch into the next game if they were being genuine, but they haven't been. And so even though this expansion did not rebuild trust, it implemented a lot of things that players wanted, as well as a lot of new historically accurate features. I still don't think Pharaoh Dynasties is a good game so much because it's just been tainted so much by the release, and that's hard. But it's a lot better than when it first launched. And this kind of leads nicely into my final point. Pharaoh may have not performed well in numbers, right? But it did do something positive for the next Total War game. No matter what your opinion is, the fact that CA Sophia didn't abandon Pharaoh, they actually turned it around, you could say, in retrospect, with the tools that they had at their disposal. We can redesign the entire game, but they still made it playable and still made it actually decent and fun for a little while for most people. And even for people who hadn't even picked it up yet, it was something interesting to do because the campaign map was so big and a little bit more sandboxy. The fact is, if it didn't perform well with Dynasty's expansion, Sophia would kind of play their cards or all in, right? If it didn't perform well, I reckon their studio would have been for the block, right? It would have been cut. And Pharaoh, despite its unknown time period, despite its Troy-based engine, its ridiculous initial price point, has given the next historical Total War game a relatively stable ground to launch on. It's still not completely stable, mind, but it's stable enough that people have a positive outlook on it, that they tried at least to make it a decent game in the end. That's something, if you think about it, the Three Kingdoms, Rome 2, Attila, only ever did after the next game was launched, right? So Rome 2 was not fixed when Attila came out, as far as I'm aware. It was still a buggy mess. Rome 2 Emperor Edition did not come out for a long time. But Pharaoh's Dynasties is complete, right? It's complete and it's playable and it's fun enough for people to actually want to buy it. It's not got the look or feels of the original Total War games. It's never going to have, because it's based on the Troy engine, right? It hasn't even got the connection between player and unit, as we've mentioned before. But the team behind it had the guts to turn it around and produce something from, let's be honest, a game we had all written off and in other circumstances would have been cancelled. And that's why I don't think Total War has died, because finally the team behind it have a somewhat stable game to launch from. And I don't like Pharaoh particularly. I just want to make that absolutely clear. I haven't played it as recently. I don't necessarily want to play it. I think it's got cool features and stuff, but doesn't discount from the fact that it finished well. That's the momentum I'm talking of. So it has a little bit of a spring. If we can capitalize on that spring and be honest and truthful about their next game, CA now have the incentive to make whatever historical Total War game they want, but it has to be good. Like Rome 1 had to be good, because if Empire 2 or Medieval 3 or whatever game it is fails, then it's over. Sega's going to shut them down, or Sega will just keep siphoning off their crew until it's basically a ghost company. We're at a point right now where I hope we're moving from a Shogun 1 to a Rome 1. We're moving from a Napoleon to a Shogun 2, you know, sort of that kind of change. I want to see incentive back in there. The incentive is, we'll lose your job if you don't succeed. And so I hope you like my take on that. It's going to be interesting to see what they produce, what they announce. It's going to be announced, I think, relatively soon, maybe early next year, maybe later this year. I don't know what it's going to be. No one knows. But they have to make the correct decision. If it's another Pharaoh, it's going to fail. If it's built on a Troy engine, it's going to fail. Or with Troy design, I mean. If they give the designers, the people who have the passion, the people who have the creativity, who understand the old games, even though they haven't ever worked on them, the scope to make the game, that might actually succeed, because their backs are against the wall and they have no choice. And that's why I think Total War is hopefully going to be resurrected, not quite dead yet. If you enjoyed this, please give a like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Take care.